I never meant to call you in your sorrow.
Hey, it's Jon Justice, and I decided to do a bonus podcast today, and I'll probably put this under the My Nerd World banner for the sake of the content. For those that aren't familiar, I'm a talk show host here in Tucson, Arizona, at 1041kqth.com. I do podcasts on the weekend, apart from my Monday through Friday show, under the banner of My Nerd World. I do Star Wars podcasts and Dale Earnhardt Jr. podcasts, and have plans to do more music-related podcasts. I'm a big fan of Depeche Mode, and that was part of the reason why I started My Nerd World. It gives me an opportunity to venture off of the normal topics of what usually lands inside of news talk radio, essentially. I'll certainly discuss the passing of Prince, which is why I'm doing this podcast on tomorrow's show, but nowhere to the extent that I'm able to do it on this podcast. And it took me a moment to decide whether or not I wanted to do this podcast, and in reflecting on the passing of Prince, and I'll kind of tell you how it played out for me this morning, I slowly began to realize in over the course of the hours after I found out that Prince had died, just how big of an influence he had on me in my life, more so than I really had expected, which brought me to a point where I decided, you know what, let me go and do a podcast and reflect a little bit from somebody that isn't necessarily an uber fan of Prince, but can certainly respect him as an artist, and also, begin to sort of realize, again, how big of an impact this individual had, as a musician, as a talent, as an artist, more so than I really had even thought about and imagined. I'm at work today. I'm doing the show, and I'm down to the last 5 or 6 minutes of the show, and I turned around, and we had the monitor on Fox News behind us. And there was a news alert, which I don't really take all that seriously, because 9 times out of 10, it's a news alert for something that's happening like a day later. They really use those very indiscriminately. But it says that authorities are called to the Prince compound. They called it in the headline over the report of a death. And immediately I thought about my friend and a former coworker, one of my best friends actually, Andrew Lee, who works in Minneapolis. And then also began to recall that, there was some headlines regarding Prince earlier in the week about a flight that he was on that had to make an emergency landing. And I thought I'd heard some reports that he had been rushed to the hospital, but just sort of in passing. But it was funny because he was kind of top of mind because of those stories. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, has he put any music out as of late? And, we could use a little more Prince in the world. I'd like to hear what some contemporary Prince sounds like right now, although it probably wouldn't sound all that different from the music he's done in the past, because his music is so timeless. And, and then the realization, as everybody kind of got through the initials, is this real? Did he really pass away? Who's reporting it? Who's not reporting it? And the word begins to go around the radio station, and we have a music station in the building, actually 2 music stations in the building, so this was obviously going to have a big effect on them. And then begin to sort of see people's reactions, the normal circumstances of what happens when somebody, an icon, like a Prince or a David Bowie passes away. I didn't do a podcast for David Bowie because he didn't have as big of an influence as Prince had on me. And what really got me thinking about recording a podcast was I went to go see my boss in the building, Leon. And he'd been sick. And I wanted to stop by and just see if he was feeling better, because there's been some schmutz going around the building, and it hasn't been any fun. And he'd been traveling, and so I was done with the show, and I figured, I'll stop on by and see if he's feeling any better. And so I popped in, and he was feeling better, and we began to talk. And it was funny because before I had a chance to mention to him that Prince had passed away, he was listening to a song off of The Cure's Disintegration album, and it was it wasn't one of the singles by any stretch. It might have even been Disintegration that he was listening to at the time, but I remember I stopped and I went, "Are you listening to The Cure, or are you listening to a radio station that is playing The Cure?" And he goes, "No, I'm listening to the Cure." He said, "Disintegration's one of my top 5 favorite albums," and I just was kind of taken aback because we really, hadn't talked music at all, and I had absolutely no idea that he was a fan of a band that I'm a massive fan of. And then we got to talking, and it turns out that he's a big fan of the Smiths and Morrissey, and I was just kind of blown away. Like, we need to go to lunch and just talk about music, because you're a fan of all the bands that I grew up with and that I still absolutely cherish. And then I told him that, I was sad to hear about Prince, and he hadn't known yet, and he was a fan of Prince and had friends of Prince, and so we kind of went through the rigmarole of talking a bit about that. And through that conversation, I slowly began to realize that music that we were discussing, the Smiths, Morrissey, the Cure, during that time frame, I mentioned Depeche Mode and what a massive Depeche Mode fan I am. I began to realize that, wow, you know what? Circling around all those bands that I was really into back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, was Prince in the background. And then I began to realize, wow, for somebody that would never claim to be a Prince fan, I actually listen to a lot of Prince. And I remember that I was just listening to Purple Rain the other day. And so just out of curiosity, I went into my iTunes. And when you go into iTunes, you can see, how often you listen to certain songs, and so you can actually do a playlist, like basically your own greatest hits. You can go into your music library and you can see how often you listen to songs. So I went in to see, I'm like, I'm really curious how often I listen to Prince. And I was shocked at the number of rotations certain songs by Prince have actually received from me. Whether it's I Would Die for You, or Darling Nikki, You Got the Look, Seven, Cream, Let's Go Crazy. I mean, you name it. I was like, wow, I didn't realize that I had listened to as much Prince as I had. And again, just reflecting, and on the drive home, listening to, I turned on Fox News because they were doing, coverage, sort of, they went into their full coverage mode of Prince. And, they had some experts on talking about what he had passed away from. We still don't know. It sounds like there's some talk about him having the flu, but, who knows at this point. These are like any breaking news story like this where you're getting hearsay. It's all fluid. And so I decided to, because I have Sirius XM in the car, I decided to switch over to the Entertainment Weekly channel, the Entertainment channel. And, they were, of course, doing wall-to-wall coverage, and that was much more of what I was looking for. A lot of industry insiders, people that had met Prince before, people that had seen him in concert, and hearing that he did, like, these random shows, like, all the time. Like, they had an interview with somebody who said that Prince in Los Angeles would go and just do these club gigs and just play for hours on end to people there that had no idea that he was going to show up. And I called my buddy Andrew in Minneapolis, and we were talking about it, and he says, oh, yeah, he's like, his house was like 10 miles away from where he lives, and that he would often just have these concerts where if you knew about it, you could come and watch him play. And he actually played there just the other night, he said. But, reflecting back on Prince and him and who he was as an artist, he's really unique because he's, I don't want to say a quintessential sort of artist in his individuality and how eccentric he was, but he was also pretty scandal-free. Apart from the battles that he had with his record label when he changed his name to a symbol, trying to get out from under that over creative differences, I can't tell you any circumstance where he was involved in any sort of scandal or controversy, not like you see nowadays, not like you see with most artists. And I guess to a certain extent David Bowie was the same way. But in thinking about that and what a loss this was going to be and how there aren't really other Princes out there. I mean, there are individuals you can kind of look to, but we're heading into this phase where, these types of icons, we're just not going to get them anymore. You're not going to get another David Bowie. We're not a society anymore that's capable of having somebody like that, I don't think. You'll have very popular artists, and you'll have very influential artists. But with that, I think you're going to have more baggage because of the pressures, because of the changes in the industry, because of social networking. And you're just not going to have these singular individuals that ended up being such trailblazers and ended up being so influential, like your David Bowies and like your Prince. And it's funny when I go back and think of growing up and sort of coming into my own at a young age and listening to music and beginning to appreciate music. You know, Prince really had a big influence, even though it wasn't really what I was into. At a time when I was listening almost exclusively to alternative rock, it was still cool. You know, growing up in Los Angeles and Orange County and listening to K-rock almost exclusively, it was still cool to listen to Prince. And if it hadn't been for Prince, I don't think that I would have the appreciation that I have for a lot of the music that I love or bands outside of the alternative genre. You know, he was able to transcend and break down those labels at a time when a lot of young people, and they still are, I guess, tended to be very singular in what they liked in terms of music. If you're an alternative rock fan, that's what you're an alternative rock fan, and you didn't listen to that other garbage. You know, this kind of thing. You know, Prince was able to kind of break through that and expose me to a lot of music that I probably wouldn't have exposed myself to via pop or blues, to a certain extent jazz elements, to a certain extent hip-hop. In terms of lyrical content and how explicit Prince was in what he did and going through an age where I'm coming out of adolescence, you know, there's a big part of Purple Rain that played a big part in crafting who I was, just even in terms of sexuality. You know, I love the song Darling Nikki as a different type of song, the way it's created, formatted, paced, storytelling. Not to mention on top of it, how it was kind of taboo growing up in a staunch Christian household, listening to this song that is so provocative, saying things that I don't completely understand. But it was done in it was done in a much more subversive way, albeit for as strange as it sounds, sexy way. You know, at a time when you had, say, 2 Live Crews that were being very overtly sexual. You know, Prince did it in a much more accessible fashion. And when I think about the age that I was when Purple Rain came out, and even before Purple Rain, and thinking about 1999, and riding my bike with my buddies and listening to this music, and the influence that it had on me as a person, and sort of the conflicting, ideas between, being raised as a Christian in a staunch Christian household and listening to this provocative music and, having discussions with my father about, making sure that you enjoy the music for what it is, but don't let it affect you in terms of what you truly believe in and being able to appreciate it, and that was a cool thing growing up in my house because that was very much a stance that my dad took and my mom took in terms of listening to music. It's like, hey, listen, all this stuff is okay. It all depends on what you do with it. And not listening to stuff that was too overtly sexual, and maybe he wasn't aware of just the nature of some of these songs that I was listening to, and probably if he was, he wouldn't have allowed me to listen to them. But again, even apart from the lyrical content, the musical content, and having the music of Prince broaden me in terms of the types of styles of music that I was listening to, and I'm still a huge fan of pop music. I'm way more open to different types of music now than I was when I was younger during those years. But I'm a huge fan of pop music while still being a fan of alternative music, and I think a lot of my pop sensibilities and the stuff that I enjoy came from how much I enjoyed Prince at an early age. And when I think about my boys, Logan's probably around the same age, 13, 14, 15, that I was. He's not listening to this stuff. They're not listening to the radio the way that I did when I was a kid and weren't exposed to this type of music and a bunch of different music the way that I was. They consume things differently now, and there are no